The final chord echoed through the empty theater like a whispered lament, and Clara Reyes knew, in that instant, she had just resurrected not only her own soul, but the lost hope of everyone who heard her, including the man who, minutes before, had tried to silence her forever. 3 hours earlier, Clara was on her knees on the cold, tiled floor of the employee restroom, scrubbing up a child's vomit, while the malicious laughter of the other cleaning ladies echoed down the hallway. Her hands, calloused and chapped from industrial detergent, trembled not from fatigue, but from a simmering rage she had learned to swallow for so long it had become part of her daily digestion. The light blue uniform, stained and too loose, hid a body that once knew the elegance of ball gowns, just as her short, chipped nails hid fingers that once danced across piano keys with the precision of a cardiac surgeon. "Clara, hurry up! There are 3 more restrooms to clean before 9. Sonia, the supervisor, yelled from outside. Her voice held that artificial tone of superiority that people with little power use to compensate for their own frustrations. Clara didn't respond. She had learned that silence, however painful, hurt less than the words that might escape her lips if she allowed herself to speak. While wiping down the smeared mirror, Clara saw her own reflection and for a second didn't recognize the woman staring back. The brown hair, once meticulously cared for, was now pulled back in a careless bun. The green eyes, which once shone under the spotlight of renowned stages, seemed dull, like the windows of an abandoned house. She was 42, but felt like she had lived 100 years. The Municipal Theater of Santos was particularly busy that morning. It was the day of the large charity event organized by Victor Almada, the powerful real estate tycoon who had become a sort of cultural patron in the city. Clara knew that name well. Everyone in the region did. Victor was the type of man who believed that money entitled him to everything and everyone, including other people's dreams. While cleaning the dressing rooms, Clara overheard snippets of conversations from the musicians preparing for the event. They talked about vocal techniques, interpretation, the emotion that should be conveyed in every note. Each word was like a needle in her exposed skin, reminding her of a time when she not only understood that language, but spoke it fluently. The flashback arrived unannounced, as it always did. Suddenly, Clara was no longer in the small, stuffy dressing room of the Municipal Theater, but on the stage of the Amazonas Theater in Manaus 15 years ago. She wore a black dress that rippled like water in the wind, and her voice soared through the galleries of the historic theater like a prayer made music. The audience was on its feet, applauding a performance of O Mio Babino Caro that had made men and women weep openly. That night, Clara Reyes was considered one of the most promising sopranos in the country, with contracts signed for seasons in Europe and invitations to international festivals. But then, as always, the memory fragmented. The car accident that killed her parents, the depression that followed, the voice that literally disappeared during the months of mourning, a phenomenon doctors called psychogenic aphonia. When she finally managed to speak again, she discovered she had lost not only her job and contracts, but also her self-confidence. The music industry is ruthless with those who show weakness, and Clara had learned that the hardest way possible. The sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway brought her back to the present. Victor Almada was making his morning rounds, inspecting every detail of the theater like a general reviewing his troops. He was an imposing man, broad-shouldered, with impeccably combed gray hair, wore an Italian suit that probably cost more than Clara earned in an entire year. His eyes, small and calculating, examined everything with the precision of someone used to finding flaws so he could exert his power. "You," he said, pointing at Clara without even looking her in the eyes. "Cleaning lady, is the stage clean?" "Yes, sir," Clara replied softly, keeping her gaze on the floor. "Yes, sir, doesn't tell me anything. I asked if it's clean the way it should be, because if it's not, you'll be spending the night here until it is." Clara felt the heat rise in her neck, a mixture of humiliation and resentment that had become all too familiar. "It's clean according to specifications, Mr. Almada." Victor approached, and Clara could smell his expensive cologne mixed with something she identified as pure disdain. "According to specifications," he repeated, cruelly mimicking her tone of voice. You people, simple folk, don't understand what excellence is. To you, clean is anything that doesn't have visible dirt. To me, clean means perfection. The other cleaning ladies in the hallway lowered their heads, pretending to be too busy to hear Clara's public humiliation. She knew that survival strategy well. She had used it many times herself. Nobody wanted to be the next target. And another thing, Victor continued, his voice taking on an even more authoritarian tone. There will be important artists in this theater today, real people, not just anyone. I want you to remain invisible. I don't want to see you. I don't want to hear you. I don't even want to smell you during the event. Is that clear? Clara nodded, but something inside her had snapped. Maybe it was the phrase real people that was the last straw. Or maybe it was the tone of voice Victor used, the same tone she had heard from producers and managers when her career crumbled. The rage she had swallowed for years began to ferment in her throat. The event began at 8 o'clock. Clara was supposed to be home by then, but Victor had requested that some staff remain on the premises for any emergencies. In practice, this meant they were to hide in the theater's basement, ready to solve any problem without disturbing the distinguished guests. Clara found a quiet corner backstage, behind a heavy curtain, from where she could perfectly hear the performance. The first part was a piano recital. The musician was technically proficient, but Clara noted the lack of emotion in his interpretation. The notes were all in the right place, but there was no soul in the music. Next it was the turn of a young soprano, probably in her 20s. Clara closed her eyes and listened. The girl had a beautiful, well-trained voice, but it lacked depth. It was the kind of performance that impressed laymen, but that any experienced professional would identify as superficial. Clara knew because she had been like that too, young, talented, but not yet touched by life deeply enough for her voice to carry true emotion. During intermission, Clara overheard Victor conversing with some guests near the curtain where she was hiding. The girl sings well, but she lacks personality, said a woman's voice, probably some socialite who considered herself a culture expert. That's what we have these days, Victor replied. Technique without soul. In my time, artists had experience. They knew what it meant to suffer for art. Today, everything is too easy, too shallow. Clara almost laughed at the irony. There was Victor, a man who had inherited his father's fortune and had never faced a real hardship in his life, talking about suffering and artistic depth. The second part of the recital began with an instrumental piece. Clara took the opportunity to move through the theater, checking if everything was in order according to her responsibilities. It was when she got close to the stage that the unthinkable happened. The young soprano, who was supposed to perform Schubert's Ave Maria as the closing number, had a complete blank. Clara saw everything from backstage, the girl in the center of the stage, paralyzed, the pianist trying to help her, the audience beginning to get uncomfortable. The young woman tried to start 3 times, but with each attempt her voice came out weaker and more trembling. Victor appeared backstage, like a hurricane. What the hell is going on? He whispered angrily to the event's artistic director. She had a blank. She's nervous, explained the director, clearly desperate. Nervous? I pay a fortune for these events, and she gets nervous. Find a solution, now. Clara watched the scene unfold. The young woman had left the stage, crying, and the audience murmured impatiently. Victor gesticulated furiously at the technical crew, demanding that they find an immediate replacement. But there was no replacement. The event, which was supposed to be the highlight of the city's cultural season, was collapsing before the eyes of 400 important people. That's when something inside Clara shifted. It wasn't a conscious decision, but an impulse that came from a very deep place in her soul. She found herself walking towards the artistic director. I can sing, she said softly. The man looked at her as if she had spoken in an alien language. What was that? I said I can sing. The Ave Maria, I know it. Victor, who had overheard the conversation, approached with an expression of disbelief and irritation. "You must be kidding me. You're a cleaner." "I'm a soprano," Clara replied, and her voice, for the first time in years, carried a firmness she had forgotten she possessed. Victor's laughter was cruel and loud. "A soprano? You? Please, I don't have time for cleaning ladies' games with delusions of grandeur." But the artistic director, desperate with the situation, grabbed Victor's arm. "Wait. At this point, anything is better than letting the event end like this. If she says she can sing, she's a cleaner." Victor repeated, as if those words were a definitive sentence on Clara's abilities. "So what?" Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "Beethoven was deaf. Ray Charles was blind. Billie Holiday was addicted. Pavarotti was overweight. Do you think talent cares about someone's profession?" The silence that followed was tense. Victor stared at her, as if she had grown 10 feet in front of him. Clara held his gaze, feeling something she hadn't felt in 15 years, the certainty of who she really was. "5 minutes, the artistic director finally said. "If you say you can, I'll give you 5 minutes to prove it." Clara nodded. "I'll need to change." 15 minutes later, Clara was in the young soprano's dressing room, wearing one of the backup dresses, a simple black but elegant model. She had let her hair down and found a forgotten lipstick in a drawer. When she looked in the mirror, for the first time in years, she saw Clara Reyes, the artist, not Clara Silva, the cleaner. Her hands were trembling, but not from fear. It was a familiar tremor, the same one she felt before every important performance. It was pure adrenaline, expectation, the anticipation of the moment when everything would become possible. From the stage, she could hear the artistic director explaining to the audience that there would be a last-minute substitution. Some murmurs of impatience spread through the audience. Clara closed her eyes, put her hand on her chest, and did what she had done hundreds of times before. She connected with her breath, her diaphragm, her soul. Backstage, Victor waited like a predator, ready to attack his prey. Clara could feel him there, hoping she would fail, so he could use her failure as further proof that people like her should know their place. She stepped onto the stage. The spotlight's glare momentarily blinded her, but her eyes quickly adjusted. The audience was a sea of curious faces, some skeptical, others bored. She walked to center stage with steady steps, and something magical happened. 15 years of silence and humiliation simply vanished. This was her home, the place where she always belonged. The pianist, an elderly gentleman with white hair and a kind gaze, offered her an encouraging smile. "We've got this," he whispered. Clara nodded, took a deep breath, and gestured for him to begin. The first piano notes filled the theater like crystalline water filling a goblet. Clara waited for her moment, feeling the music flow through her body like blood in her veins. And then, when her time came, she opened her mouth and sang, "Ave Maria, gratia plena." The voice that emerged from her throat wasn't the same as 15 years ago. It was deeper, richer, laden with the weight of lived experience. Each note carried years of pain, loss, and enforced silence. But it also carried something she hadn't had before, the wisdom of someone who had looked into the abyss and decided to return. The effect on the audience was immediate. The murmurs ceased completely. People who had been looking at their phones lifted their heads. Clara could feel the collective attention focusing on her like a sunbeam through a lens. She continued singing, and with each musical phrase, something within her and the audience transformed. Schubert's Ave Maria is a prayer, a plea for intercession, a cry of hope. But from Clara's throat, it became something more, a declaration that beauty can emerge from suffering, that art can flourish in the most unlikely places, that the human spirit is stronger than any circumstance. Mid-song, Clara opened her eyes and looked directly at the audience. She saw tears on the faces of people who probably hadn't cried in years. She saw hardened executives bowing their heads in respectful silence. She saw elegant ladies clutching handkerchiefs with trembling hands. And backstage, she saw Victor Almada paralyzed, his superior expression replaced by something it took her a few seconds to identify: genuine shock. As she reached the climax of the music, Clara allowed all her pain, all her frustration, all the years of silence to transform into pure vocal energy. Her voice soared, crystalline and powerful, filling every inch of the theater, echoing through the walls, as if the building itself were singing along with her. And then, something extraordinary happened. The audience, which until then had been in respectful silence, began to visibly emote. Clara saw a man in an expensive suit discreetly wiping his eyes. A young woman in the front row was openly sobbing. An elderly couple held hands, as if the music had reminded them why they fell in love decades ago. Backstage, other theater employees had gathered to listen. Sonia, the supervisor, who always treated Clara with disdain, had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with surprise. The security guards, the technicians, the other cleaning ladies, all were there, witnessing the birth of a miracle. Clara ended the song with a long, perfect note that seemed suspended in the air like a blessing. The silence that followed lasted an eternity. For a moment, not even collective breathing could be heard. Then, one person stood, then another, and another. In a matter of seconds, the entire audience was on its feet, applauding with an intensity that made the theater floor vibrate. Clara remained center stage, breathless, feeling warm tears rolling down her cheeks. She had forgotten what this was like, the complete connection between artist and audience, the moment when two souls, or 400 souls, touch each other through music. The applause continued for almost 5 minutes. People shouted "Bravo!" with voices choked with emotion. Clara took her bows, thanked the pianist, and as she finally prepared to leave the stage, something inside her whispered a truth she had forgotten. She was alive again. Backstage, the reception was controlled chaos. The artistic director embraced her with tears in his eyes. "My God," he repeated. "My God, where have you been hiding?" But it was Victor Almada who surprised her most. The man who minutes before had publicly humiliated her was standing in a corner, staring at her with an expression she had never seen on his face: vulnerability. He approached slowly, like someone approaching something sacred that they don't want to profane. He began, then stopped. He tried again. Where did you learn to sing like that?" Clara stared at him for a long moment before answering. "University of Minas Gerais Music Conservatory, specializations in Italy and Germany. 15 years of professional career before." She paused. "Before I became a cleaning lady." Victor lowered his head. For the first time in his life, the man who believed that money could buy and define everything was face to face with something his categories couldn't explain. "I didn't know," he mumbled. "How could you know?" Clara asked, her voice calm but firm. "You never saw me as a person, only as a function." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Victor Almada, the man who commanded companies and decided the professional destinies of hundreds of people, was discovering that he had spent months treating an internationally trained artist like a piece of furniture. Can I ask what happened? How did you?" Clara considered not answering. It would be easy to simply leave, leaving him with his questions and his shame, but something in his expression, a genuine humility she suspected was rare, made her decide differently. "My parents died in a car accident at the height of my career. I fell into a deep depression and lost my voice because of the psychological trauma. When I was able to sing again, 2 years later, the industry had moved on. With no family, no resources, and no support network, I had to survive. Cleaning pays the bills." Victor closed his eyes as if he'd been punched in the gut. "And he began. You treated me exactly as I expected to be treated, Clara said. As society treats people in my position, you're not especially cruel, Mr. Almada, you're just ordinary. The word ordinary hit Victor like a lightning bolt. He, who had spent his entire life considering himself special, superior, was being called ordinary by a woman he had repeatedly humiliated. Is there anything I can do to make amends? Clara smiled for the first time in the conversation. You can start by learning the names of the people who work for you, and maybe, next time you judge someone by their profession, remember that we are all far more complex than our jobs suggest. At that moment, the artistic director reappeared, breathless with excitement. Clara, I need to talk to you. Urgent. There are people here who want to meet you. Business executives, producers, journalists. Clara looked around, and for the first time noticed a small crowd had formed backstage. Elegant people, some she recognized from cultural magazines, were waiting for a chance to speak with her. Miss Reyes, said a middle-aged woman, elegantly dressed, I'm Patricia Albuquerque, from the State Cultural Foundation. Your performance was extraordinary. We'd like to discuss possibilities, and so began a night that would completely change the course of Clara's life. One after another, people approached with offers, invitations, opportunities. A producer from Sao Paulo talked about an opera project. A businesswoman from Rio mentioned an international festival. A journalist requested an interview for a classical music magazine. Clara listened to everything with a mixture of joy and surrealism. After years of invisibility, suddenly everyone wanted to see her, hear her story, work with her. It was as if she had spent years underwater and had finally emerged to breathe. When she finally managed to extricate herself from the crowd, it was past midnight. The theater was almost empty, only a few staff members finishing the post-event cleaning. Clara found Victor sitting alone in a front-row seat, staring at the empty stage. She approached slowly. May I sit? He nodded, but said nothing for a few minutes. Finally he spoke. I'm 63 years old. I've built a business empire. I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. I'm respected throughout the region. He paused. And today I discovered I know nothing about people. Clara didn't answer immediately. She was tired, emotionally exhausted, but also more alive than she had felt in years. It's not about knowing, she said finally. It's about seeing. You chose not to see me, just as many people chose not to see me all these years. How did you endure? Victor asked. How did you manage to keep this, he gestured vaguely, hidden for so long? Clara smiled sadly. Because when you have something real inside you, it doesn't disappear just because the world decides to ignore it. It stays there waiting. Sometimes it hurts so much you want it to disappear, but it won't. It's part of who you are. Victor nodded slowly. I have a question, and you may not want to answer. Why didn't you give up? Why didn't you leave here? Try to start over somewhere else? Clara considered the question for a long moment. Because running away doesn't cure anything. You just take your problems with you. I needed to go through this here, where everything started to fall apart, to be able to truly begin again. They sat in silence for a few more minutes, 2 human beings who had met completely unexpectedly on a night neither would ever forget. Clara, Victor said finally, I know you probably don't want anything from me after how I treated you. But if there's anything I can do to support your return to music, Clara looked him directly in the eyes. There is. You can treat your employees with dignity. You can remember that every person who works for you has a story, dreams, talents you might never discover. You can use your power to lift people up instead of putting them down. Victor swallowed hard. You're right. I will try to be different. Don't try. Clara said, rising. She headed for the exit but stopped at the door and turned to him one last time. Oh, and Mr. Almada, thank you. For what? he asked, confused. For giving me the opportunity to remember who I am. 6 months later, Clara Reyes was back on professional stages, but now her story was different. She wasn't just a talented soprano, she was an artist who had faced adversity and emerged stronger. Her performances had an emotional depth that touched people viscerally, because every note carried the authenticity of someone who had truly lived. The Municipal Theater of Santos created a scholarship program for employees who wanted to develop artistic talents. The program was called Hidden Voices and was personally funded by Victor Almada, who had become a patron of a very different kind, one who looked for talent in places where nobody usually looked. And Clara, whenever she returned to that stage for special performances, remembered the night she rediscovered her voice, not just her musical voice, but her voice as a human being, the courage to stand up, to demand to be seen, to claim her place in the world. Because sometimes, she thought as she watched the audience during her performances, the greatest act of rebellion isn't shouting against oppression, it's simply refusing to disappear, it's insisting on fully existing, it's letting your light shine even when the whole world seems to conspire to extinguish it. And that night at the Municipal Theater, Clara Reyes had done exactly that. She had refused to remain invisible. She had sung not only to the audience, but to all the people who had ever felt small, ignored, underestimated. She had proven that talent knows no social class, that art can flourish in any soil, and that sometimes the most extraordinary person in the room is exactly the one you never thought to look at twice. The final chord had echoed through the theater like a whispered lament, but also like a declaration. Clara Reyes was back, and this time to stay.